Hello everyone, and welcome back to another rousing discussion of anatomy and physiology. By now you should have already watched both parts of the introduction/histology lecture that are posted for you. Now today what we're going to talk about is the integumentary system. Now when you see the term integumentary, it looks like a really big, sophisticated thing. And it is, but integumentary is just a really fancy way to say your skin and all those accessory structures that are associated with it. So let's learn a little bit more about your skin and why it's important. So the integumentary system is made up, or the integument is made up of two different parts. You have your cutaneous membrane, which consists of about 90% of the integumentary system, and then you have those accessory structures. So those are the two parts that make up your integumentary system. Now, a lot of students always, every semester, make the same mistake when I put this question on their first quiz or test, and I ask them what are the two parts the integument is made of, and they'll say the dermis and the epidermis. Not quite. It's made of the cutaneous membrane and the accessory structures. So what is the job of the skin? And remember that I said in the lecture, this is where we're going to cover our physiology. So you're going to hear us quite often refer to the job of various different structures. So what is the job of the skin? What is the job of those cutaneous membranes, which consist of the dermis, epidermis, and the subcutaneous layer? Well, it helps to protect. That's one of the basic jobs of the skin, that it keeps those things that are on the outside, outside, and what needs to be on the inside, inside. So it helps to protect the underlying tissues and the organs. It also helps to maintain homeostasis in your water-salt balance, and it excretes salts and waters and organic waste, and it can do so via your glands. It helps to maintain your body temperature. Without your skin and this large organ, in fact, your skin is the largest organ in your entire body because it covers all of your body. It helps to maintain your body temperature. So your temperature fluctuations would change quite drastically if we did not have your skin to maintain that. It also helps to synthesize vitamin D3. Vitamin D3, or cholecalciferol, is very important in bone development, and that it makes sure that those calcium salts and those phosphorus salts get deposited properly in the bone so that it can ensure its strength. Without vitamin D3, your bones would be very gummy-like, if you will, and it wouldn't have that hard, rigid nature to them, and it could cause vitamin D3 insufficiencies can cause what are known as rickets, and we'll look at rickets in a few slides. It also helps to store some lipids in the subcutaneous layer, which we all know lipids are used for storage, and it helps detect sensations outside of the body, things like touch, pressure, pain, and temperature. So the cutaneous membrane, or one of the two parts of the integument, because remember, the integument is made out of the cutaneous membrane and the accessory structures, things like hair and glands and nails. The two parts the cutaneous membrane is made up of are going to be your, so we have cutaneous membrane, accessory structures. The two parts, or the parts that your cutaneous membrane are made up of, are your epidermis, which is a part that we can actually see, and that consequently is the part that's dead, so those made out of a layer of dead skin cells, and then your dermis, which can be further divided into the upper layer, the papillary layer, and then the lower layer, the reticular layer. And then all of these are accessory structures of the integument. Now, we're not going to cover every last one of these accessory structures the way that your book covers them in great detail. We're just going to hit on the hot spots. So for your exam and for your quiz, only that information which I have covered in lecture as it pertains to the integument, or Chapter 5, is what you will be responsible for. So any portion in your book that goes into depth on the epidermis, you're going to want to make sure you read that. However, any portion that goes in depth on hair follicles, you don't need to go over, well, we do some hair follicles, but you don't have to go through all the very detailed information. So you'll be able to get kind of a gist of what it is that I want you to go over and what it is that I am expecting for you to have memorized. So no, you do not need to read that chapter cover to cover, because we're not going to cover every single thing in there. So breaking down the cutaneous membrane into its various parts, we have that epidermis, which is the superficial layer. It's the outermost layer. Then we have the dermis, which is made out of connective tissue. And does anyone remember what type of connective tissue your dermis is made out of? look like a Jackson Pollock painting or abstract art? Yep, areolar tissue. So we have our areolar tissue, and then we have these different accessory structures. So we're going to discuss hair and nails and the different types of exocrine glands. But remember, the information that's in your textbook is a lot more detailed than what I'm asking you to learn about these accessory structures. So really just limit what you need to know as it pertains to accessory structures to what we go over in our lecture. So what other connections to different organ systems do you see here? I definitely see a connection to the nervous system with a tactile corpuscle, and that it can detect touch and detect pressure from outside of the body and send that information to the brain and the spinal cord so that it can coordinate an appropriate response. More connection to the nervous system. I see connection to your connective tissue and to energy storage, and even connection to the circulatory system. So although the skin doesn't really get as much cool accolade for its physiological components as maybe your pancreas or your digestive system, but it's still very important. And as you'll find with all of the organ systems that we're going to discuss this semester, that they're always going to be interconnected with one another. No organ system is an island unto itself. They're all going to connect and work together. So one thing that's adversely affecting one organ system is going to, in a way, adversely affect all the other 10 organ systems. There's 11 total, so the one we're talking about. All of the other organ systems are going to be adversely affected as well. Maybe not in the exact same way, but at some point or another they will be affected. So when we look at the epidermis, what we notice is that the epidermis is made out of stratified squamous epithelium, something that we have looked at in lab class, and we saw those layers and layers and layers and layers and layers of flat cells. The epidermis is also avascular, which means it does not have a direct blood supply. Now that doesn't mean that those cells, those stratified squamous epithelium cells, aren't able to get any nutrients. In fact, those cells at the basement membrane or the basal lamina, where the germinative aspects of the cells are, they're able to get nutrients and oxygen via diffusion from the lower layer, the dermal layer. Your epidermis is made up of two different types of keratinocytes. Keratin is the protein that covers the skin to make it waterproof, not water resistant, but waterproof. So that's why when you get out the shower, the water will bead up on you as opposed to being all soaked into your body. And you also, so those keratinocytes are the cells that have been keratinized. And your epidermis can be made up of two different types. You have thick skin, which has 5 layers, and thin skin, which has 4 layers. So the thick skin is going to be found in places like the palms of your hands and the soles of your feet, places where there are lots and lots of abrasion, and the area is going to constantly have a greater amount of damage to it than another part of your body. Thin skin, everywhere else. Thick skin, palms of your hands, soles of your feet. Those 5 different layers of keratinocytes have various different names because they are slightly different in the types of cells that hang out in that layer. So the very basement layer, the layer at the very bottom of your epidermis, so down at the bottom, we have the stratum germinativum. Stratum germinativum is the area where the cells are actually alive. This is where they are constantly dividing. We can call these adult stem cells. The layer right above that is called the stratum spinosum. The stratum spinosum gets its name because at this point the cells are starting to go through morphological and chemical changes where there's more keratin that's being added to the cells, and they're starting to dehydrate a little bit, and so the cytoskeleton starts to kind of stick out a little bit and makes them look like little spiny balls. The next layer, so we're rising up to the top, is the stratum granulosum. At this point, we have high keratinization taking place. At the stratum granulosum, these cells are, if they're not already dead, they're pretty close to being dead. And they're very dehydrated, and they look they're little grains in them, so hence the name granulosum. Stratum lucidum is our clear layer, and then the outermost layer that you can actually see, which consists of the most layers of cells, and these are all dead cells, is the stratum cornea. So when you look at the thin skin only has 4 layers. And if we look at this picture over here, what layer is missing? We still have our stratum cornea, not nearly as thick as we saw for the thick skin. And then we notice that we have the stratum germinativum, the spinosum, the granulosum, the stratum cornea, and the one that's missing is that clear layer, that stratum lucida. So stratum germinativum, some hallmarks or functions, jobs, aspects of this tissue or this layer of tissue is that the stratum germinativum is a germinative layer. It has many germinative cells here. They're going to be attached to the basal membrane by hemidesmosomes. They form a nice tight bond at that basal membrane between these epidermis and the dermal papilla, the very top part of it. That invagination, that connection is what makes the fingerprints. Everyone's fingerprints are pretty much different from one another. Even if we look at identical twins, not all 10 of their fingerprints are going to be the same. They will have a couple that are different. And your fingerprints are not just genetically determined, your fingerprints are also determined by the environment. So even while in utero, identical twins are going to touch different things. They're going to touch different parts of the uterus. They maybe rub the uterine wall, or they might rub the other twin's head, or they might play with the umbilical cord more than the other. So even though many of their fingerprints will be the same, they're not all going to be the exact same. There are going to be some differences. You also have Merkel cells in this area that help to respond to touch. So in places where you don't have any hair to kind of feel that tactile pressure or that soft, sweet sensation of touch, we have Merkel cells that are capable of doing that. For other places on your body where there's hair, that's how those erectopili muscles can help to, and there's nerve endings that help to detect touch there. And then you also have melanocytes. And melanocytes are responsible for skin coloration or pigmentation. At the stratum spinosum, this is where, as I said before, the cells are starting to shrink and the cytoskeleton sticks out. They look kind of spiny. They're reproduced by the division of the stratum germinativum. They increase the thickness of the epithelium, and then we also have immune cells, those Langerhans cells, in this area as well. At the stratum granulosum, those cells begin to dehydrate and die. Very important aspect of this layer. In the stratum spinosum and the stratum germinativum, we were dealing with living cells. From here on out, these cells and these other strata are going to be dead. So at this point, we start to have the dividing stops, and the cells are going to start producing that keratin, that fibrous protein. And this fibrous protein helps them give the cells their water-proofing nature. Stratum lucida, only found on the thick skin, covers the stratum granulosum. It is a clear layer of skin. And then found on the stratum cornea, or the horn layer, is the exposed skin. And it consists of 15 to 30 layers of keratinized cells, depending on where we're finding this final external layer. And it is water resistant because of the keratinization process that began to happen as we moved up from the stratum germinativum to the stratum spinosum to the stratum granulosum. So at that area, that's when we start to have that keratinization takes place. Your outer layer of skin is shed and replaced about every 2 weeks. So those cells in the stratum germinative layer are always going to be pushed up and out to the surface. Now the process of keratinization itself takes about 15 to 30 days, and it's got such a wide range there because it depends on other factors. And it takes a while for the cells to move from that germinative layer to that corneal layer. The formation of that layer of dead protective cells is filled with keratin, and you find these keratinized cells in all exposed skin surfaces except for your eyes. So now that we've talked about those different layers of the epidermis, let's talk a little bit about perspiration. There are two different types that we're going to go over, sensible and insensible perspiration. Sensible perspiration means that it makes sense for you to perspire. So sweating because you're hot, sweating because you're running or you're nervous about something, your body is heated up and that's why you're sweating. So water excreted by the sweat glands is an example of sensible perspiration. On the other side, insensible perspiration means that you're just losing water off to the environment, and an easy way to remember it is that it just doesn't make any sense because you're not hot or anything, so why are you losing water off? Well, remember the laws of osmosis and the rules of osmosis, that water moves from an area of high concentration to low concentration. So water, there's more water concentrated in your body than the external environment of the air, so you're going to lose some fluid via evaporation through that stratum cornea. great examples of it, so there's going to be some that's just lost every day, but great examples of large quantities of insensible perspiration happen with burns and blisters, and even if you're sitting in a hypertonic solution, or if you're sitting in the salt water, you're going to really see the, well, you won't really see, but it's a good example of how water leaves from the inside of your body to the outside of your body. So the flip side of perspiration is hydration. If you can perspire or lose water out to the environment by sitting in a hypertonic solution, salt water being an example of that, then you can become overly hydrated if you're sitting in a hypotonic solution. So in hydration, this actually causes swelling of those epithelial cells. And the swelling of those cells actually causes the area to get a little larger, but it will start to invaginate a bit, like you see the wrinkle that we're looking at here. It'll start to invaginate a bit in order to compensate for that increased surface area. So when you get all pruny, that's not because you're sitting in salt water. You usually find it when you're washing dishes or when you're in the bathtub for a really long time. You can start to see yourself getting a little pruny there because you're sitting in a solution that is hypotonic. So the water on the outside in that bathtub is coming onto the inside of your cells. So your homework assignment for this weekend is that you have to take a nice long bath until you start to feel yourself get pruny. Now, if your loved ones or children or anyone else comes knocking at your door while you're doing your homework assignment, just remind them that this is a legitimate homework assignment. I want you to actually feel that process taking place. And if you're very conscious of it, you can actually start to feel your fingers and your toes start to swell a little bit right before this sort of wrinkling takes place. So skin color is another aspect of the epidermis. There are two different types of coloration that we associate with the skin. Well, two major types of coloration we associate with the skin. Melanin is the big one, and then we have keratin. Melanin is always going to be produced by specialized cells called melanocytes. Melanocytes produce a yellowish or a yellow-brown to black pigment. And the melanocytes, what they will do is that they will transfer their melanosomes or their melanin-containing granules, they will transfer them to the cells in each of these various different levels. Now here's the kicker. No matter what race or what color you are, so whether you're white Irish or you are, Caribbean, West Indian, no matter how dark or how light you are, we all have about the same number of melanocytes. Isn't that interesting? So the question you're probably asking is, well, why do we have a range in color differences? Well, the difference between someone like me who is pretty darkly complected and someone who's not as darkly complected as I is that my melanocytes, their melanin that's produced, they're going to transfer it early, even as early as the stratum germinativa, and they're going to transfer it often. So they're transferring that melanin more often than someone who's of whiter complexion. And what skin colors are is a great example of evolutionary adaptation. My ancestors actually hail from the West Indies, Latin America, and Africa. So the places that my ancestors come from, they have lots and lots of direct sunlight. Having all that direct sunlight is going to not be so good for your skin if you don't have some sort of UV protectant. And let's think about my ancestors, 1,000 years ago. They didn't really have, sunblock in the way that we have sunblock, if you will. So their natural protection was melanin. Melanin is your UV protectant. So for my ancestors, those that had melanocytes that would transfer melanin early in the process of making these keratinocytes or skin cells, and often, like starting way down here and doing it a lot of times as opposed to starting way up here, those individuals are more likely to survive in areas with direct sunlight as opposed to those individuals that didn't have this transfer of melanin as early and as often. Keratin is an orange-yellow pigment, and it can accumulate in the epidermal cells, the fatty tissues of the dermis. When you think of keratin, you probably think of carrots. Carrots and squash, they have that nice orange color to them. It's called beta-carotene. And if you are lightly complected enough, like my daughter is, if you eat lots and lots and lots and lots of carrots, that beta-carotene color can actually manifest itself in your skin, and you can have kind of an orange glow happening to you. Now, I don't know if that's what Trump deal is. Maybe he eats a lot of carrots. Maybe that's why he's orange. But it can definitely happen. All right, so the job of the melanocytes we talked about is to, and let's get our check mark out here because it's very important, protect the skin from ultraviolet radiation. It's my own built-in UV protection, so being nice and darkly complected as I am, it makes me, it's like my SPF 1000. Now, even with that being said, I can still burn, so I do still put sunblock on because, it's kind of a vanity reason. I don't want wrinkles, but I do still put sunblock on because we can still burn. If you are African American or of African descent or very darkly complected, you'll probably say, oh, I never get a sunburn. I don't turn red like that. You might not turn red, but if your skin actually pills after being out in the sun for long periods of time, baby, you're burned. So that is a sunburn, and we are just, skin cancer can be just as risky for people that are dark complected than those that are light complected. It actually can be more risky because we're less likely to wear sunblock. So other coloring changes that can happen with the skin, you can have oxygenation also contributes to the color of the skin. When blood vessels dilate because they're hot, and the skin can redden. If the blood flow decreases, those blood vessels will constrict and they'll pull away from the surface of the skin, so the skin looks a bit more pale. Cyanosis is a bluish tint to the skin that's caused by hypoxia, which is a severe reduction in blood flow. Therefore, those oxygenated cells aren't getting to that area, and you notice it as a bluish color of the skin. This is depending on why this hypoxia has taken place, especially if you see it in little babies, it could be life-threatening. So we don't want to see this bluish tint to the skin. Other conditions and illnesses that affect skin color are jaundice, which is a buildup of bilirubin, of bile, as a result of the liver not functioning properly. Addison's disease, JFK had Addison's disease. It's a disease of the pituitary gland, and it actually causes the skin to get darker. So JFK has that sexy tanned glow. It wasn't because he was out sunning himself on the South Lawn of the White House. It was because he had Addison's disease. And then vitiligo, many of you all are probably the most famous person that you would know that has vitiligo, Michael Jackson, and that it's a loss of melanocytes. So whereas Addison's disease is a hyperpigmentation of the skin, vitiligo is a hypopigmentation, that the body just starts to lose those melanocytes. And it can happen in people of all different races, but it's just much more noticeable for people that are darkly complected. So now moving on to the next portion, we're going down from the epidermis and moving down into the dermis. So down in this dermis, we have two parts of it, the papillary layer, which is closest to the surface or closest to the epidermis. And remember, that helps in part to form those fingerprints in the papillary ridges with the epidermis. And then we have the reticular layer, which is a little bit lower, contains more of this dense regular connective tissue, more collagen, but there's still blood vessels, lymphatic vessels, and nerve fibers that are in both the papillary and the reticular layer. They just get a little bit larger and they're more prominent as the further down we go. So dermatitis is an inflammation of the papillary layer, the top layer of the dermis, and it can be caused by things like poison ivy, radiation, chemical radiation, or mechanical irritants on there, and it kind of gives that rash characteristic to it. Always a good classic, giveaway that is dermatitis is that there's some pain or some itchiness that's associated with it. So on to vitamin D3. So remember, the job of vitamin D3 is to aid in the absorption of calcium and phosphate to make sure that the bone it's nice and strong. This is a question that would be, or this is a process that would be a good short answer question for your exam. So I would want to know what's happening in this picture. So how does your body make vitamin D3? Now, when we say that it's a vitamin, usually that's something that you have to get from outside of your body, but in this case, that is kind of a misnomer because we can get it fortified in things like our milk and our orange juice, but we can also make it. We make vitamin D3 with sunlight. So the sunlight causes the epidermal cells to make chocalciferol, or vitamin D3. The liver and the kidneys are going to convert vitamin D3 into calciferol. Notice things that are highlighted are super, super, super important. Everything on here is important though. Calciferol then helps to aid in calcium and phosphorus absorption for the bone. If you don't have adequate sunlight, which in my grandmother's time, my grandmother before she passed away this January, the only way you could get vitamin D3, she lived in a farm in a place called Marion, Alabama. The only way you could get vitamin D3 was through sunlight, from playing outside and being outside. They didn't get it fortified in their milk and orange juice and other supplements like we do today. So if you didn't go outside and play, you would not have that calcium and phosphorus absorption in your bones, so they would be a little weak and kind of gummy, and it would cause the legs to bow out. So I remember growing up and we would visit my grandmother, and she would say, we wanted to stay inside and watch TV or whatever. That was just unheard of to her. She's like, you better go outside and play or you're going to get the rickets. And I thought, I'm like, Grandma, come on, what is that? Until I got to college and I said, whoa, Grandma's really smart, because there's a lot of stuff, those old wives' tales that she told me, that were actually based in actual real science. So here, my friends, are the rickets. So insufficient vitamin D3 can cause the legs or the bones to bow out because of all the excess weight that's on them as they develop. They are not as strong because they don't have those calciums and those phosphate salts that are deposited in them. They can bow out. But we don't really see that much in industrialized countries, because even if you don't go outside to play as a child, you get it fortified in different foods. So dermal skin damage, things like sagging and wrinkles are caused by dehydration, so make sure you drink enough water. Age, that's something you just can't really help, even hormonal changes. But UV exposure and staying hydrated are two things that you can help to combat wrinkles. Just about everybody's going to get wrinkled except for me, of course, because I've already claimed in the universe that I'm not getting any wrinkles. And stretch marks are also dermal damage, where the skin has been stretched out from either pregnancy or weight gain, and then the collagen bundles that are in those areolar tissues underneath the endodermal layer, they get stretched out, and when they come back, they don't recoil as nicely. So you have stretch marks that are here. So the dermis has what we call these lines of cleavage, and these lines of cleavage, if you make a cut that's parallel to them, the wound is going to heal nicely. If you make a cut at a right angle to it, so if you cut across a line of cleavage, then it has a possibility of opening up and causing the scar. So then the very bottom layer of the cutaneous membranes is the subcutaneous layer of the hypodermis. It lies below the integument, lots of elastic areolar tissue and adipocytes that are there. And this is the site of subcutaneous injections that when we use a hypodermic needle. So our first accessory structure that we're going to talk about, we're going to talk about a handful of these, are your hair. The job of your hair is to protect and insulate. It also helps to guard openings against particles of insects. Look at the inside of your nose. And it's very sensitive to light touch. So if a mosquito lands on you, before it actually touches your skin, it'll touch your hair first, and you'll feel that with the nerves ending surrounding your hair, and you might be able to swat it off in time. So parts of the hair that are very important that you should remember are the subcutaneous gland, or the sebaceous glands, which will lubricate the hair, and they produce a chemical called sebum that helps to control microbial growth. The erector pili muscle, it's the involuntary smooth muscle that causes your hair to stand up on end, and it also produces that goosebump sort of feeling that you get there. So it is a smooth muscle, so it's not under your voluntary control. You don't think about it consciously doing that. The hair shaft is not actually attached to the integument. It's also dead. It's the part that, we spend all this money and time on with, hair products and whatnot, but it's not even alive. And then we have our hair root down here at the bottom, which attaches to the integument. And then we have these hair root cells, which they are alive down there deep in the dermis. The different types of glands in the skin, sebaceous glands we've already talked about. Those are oil glands. And these different glands may have different modes of secretion. The modes of secretion are pretty important for us, and we'll talk about those in a second. Sebaceous glands are considered holocrine glands. A holocrine gland means that the entire gland is going to be explode in order to release this content. So in the case of sebaceous glands that make this sebum or this oil, the entire gland is going to explode. So what type of layering configuration do you think it makes sense for a holocrine gland to have? Stratified or simple? It makes more sense for it to be stratified, absolutely right, because the entire gland is going to blow up every time it releases its secretants, it releases its product. So we need another line of cells behind that can take up for that. Sweat glands, you have two different types, apocrine and merocrine. Apocrine glands are your stinky glands, so they're found in stinky places like your armpits and your groin and around your nipples, which I don't personally think my nipples are stinky, so maybe that's like an exception to the rule. But in your armpits and in your groin, you have those glands. Merocrine glands, also called eccrine glands, are much more widely distributed than the apocrine glands are. They're responsible for our sensible perspiration, so you sweat because you're hot, and that sweating because you're hot is known as cutaneous evaporation, and it helps to cool your skin. It also helps to, in that sweat you have water and you have electrolytes, so it helps to maintain your electrolyte balance. And it can even flush away microorganisms and different harmful chemicals from keeping them from getting into the box. So as you can see, one of the really big jobs of the skin and these accessory structures is protection. Another process I want you to be familiar with is the repair of the integument when an injury happens. So you should know each one of these steps, and you should know each of these terms that we're going to discuss and what their job is. So if we have a breach in the skin, there's going to be bleeding that happens. These mast cells that are found in the dermis, their job is to trigger inflammation. And when they trigger inflammation, that means that they're going to release chemicals that are going to sound the alarm to bring more immune cells to this area to heal and to fight a potential infection. As that's happening, a scab will form on top, and then you have these macrophages and these fibroblasts and these migrating epithelial cells. All of those germinative cells are those in the migrating epithelial cells are germinative cells, so they're coming from here on down to the bottom, are going to segregate and go around the wound. So at the top part we had a scab, but underneath is where all the magic is happening. We're repairing it. And we're repairing it with macrophages, which help to clean up debris, and fibroblasts, which are going to give rise to various different proteins like elastic fibers or collagen bundles in order to repair this dermis that's been damaged. The macrophages clean the area, and then you're left with scar tissue. So those fibroblasts and endothelial cells continue to move in, and they produce what we call scar tissue or granulation tissue. So for your exam, so far we've talked about two different physiological processes. We talked about the repair of the integument just now, and then we talked about the process of making vitamin D3. Make sure you very intimately understand both of those processes. It's not just enough to listen to this lecture. Go to your book and also read over what's happening for the repair of the integument and the production of vitamin D3. And then the last thing here, types of integumentary injuries, since we've talked about how to repair the integument. Not all integumentary injuries result in, bleeding outside of the body. Some things can be just an abrasion, where it's a scraping away of the upper layer of skin or mucous membranes, and those abrasions, we consider something an abrasion if it's only happened in a limited area. Lacerations or jagged wounds or cuts, which are a little bit different from an incision. An incision is a cut that's been produced by a surgical instrument, such as a scalpel, and it creates an opening to get to an organ or space in the body. Incisions are done on purpose by a trained medical professional, I would hope, and lacerations are done on accident. So that's an easy way to keep those two separated. A puncture is an injury where a sharp, narrow object goes in, deeply penetrates the skin, and comes straight back out. I remember she's now 8 years old, but I think she was about 3 or 4. We went to the doctor, and she had to get a series of shots. And she told the nurse, "Oh my goodness, she just punctured me." And I was just so impressed that she had used it at such a small age, and she's still my little resident genius, that at such a young age that she used that term correctly. A contusion is just, street name for a contusion is a bruise. So this is an injury that does not really disrupt the integrity of the skin itself, so it's not opening up the skin like the other items were, and you don't have any bleeding that happens on the surface, but there is swelling, discoloration, and pain that's associated with a bruise. All right, so that is the end of the integumentary system. So when we come back, the next thing that we're going to talk about is skeletal system. So there's a lot of fun stuff that's happening in the skeletal system. All right, well, wherever you are in this wonderful universe, have an amazing day. See you soon.